specific direction and see how it applied to us as practicing devotees, because most of you, I assume, are practicing or have accepted the paradigm of Bhakti, Krishna consciousness. So wanted to focus our attention on the relevance of the verse and the purport that Prabhupada so beautifully writes to us as practicing Vaishnavas. So I would like to quickly take a poll and hear from you first on what struck you about the verse and the purport. I think Prabhupada's purport, every sentence is actually very thoughtfully, you can unpack every single sentence here. And there is so many directions we can go in. So anything that struck you to begin with? Yes, Adipurush. Unmute.
No, everyone should be able to unmute themselves.
Thank you.
Strikes me as my own experience of fear that I won't have enough. Right?
Yes.
And the moments of sanity, hearing Prabhupada say, just take just what you need. And for today, there's a verse in the Bible, suffice unto the day of the problems thereof. Mm-hmm. And not to just, because the mind just, well, what about tomorrow? What about when I retire? What about whether? What about? And it's a maddening schizophrenic going back and forth saying, thank you, Krishna. And the Hasidic Jewish people say, who is a wealthy man? One who is satisfied with whatever God gives. It's not a quantitative thing. It's a choice to say, okay, so Lord, by your arrangement, I'm starving to death. Okay, I will accept it. Whatever, just to accept what Krishna is giving is sanity.
Thank you.
In the moment.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anything that struck you from the purport?
Haribol.
Haribol.
It really struck me when Prabhupada was saying that we're establishing various farms, especially in America, to show how to be happy and content with minimum necessities of life and to save time for self-realization.
Right. It's almost a throwback in time when you hear Prabhupada say, we are establishing. It's almost like entering his mind as he's writing this purport. Thank you. Yeah. But we live in a city, most of us.
Yeah.
Most of us live in cities. So how does it apply to us?
Yeah. Same principle.
Good. Athena, I thought it was interesting that Srila Prabhupada recommended Ashtanga yoga system. If one has too much sense gratification, I always thought Bhakti yoga system would be the answer to all. It's true, Bhakti yoga is the answer to all. But so many times we find it so hard to experience Krishna. And that's why Yama and Niyama are also recommended. If you read the first verse of the Upadeshamrita, actually begins with Vachuvegam. The controlling the urges of the senses is how it begins. And there is a place for that. Even in the practice of Krishna consciousness, it's actually extremely important. And this is something that I wanted to touch, hopefully later in today. How, as devotees, sense control is something that we need to practice separately, in the sense of engaging all the senses in Krishna's service, yes, but also practicing sense control is very, very critical and important. Bhakti Center said, when a person considers sense gratification the aim of life, he certainly becomes mad after materialistic living and engages in all kinds of sinful activity. True. Can anyone think of a verse in the Gita that corroborates to this particular statement? Krishna answers a question that Arjuna asks. Arjuna asks a question in chapter 3. That's the clue.
The verse about why we are forcefully being engaged in sense gratification.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Purusha.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
answers with Kamesha, Krodesha.
Rajo Guna Samudbhava, right? So please, can you explain, Goshen?
You can explain, Prabhu.
No, please.
So Krishna says the force that is that even though unwillingly a person is being forced to perform is due to the due to lust, which is
Yeah.
like due to the mode of passion, rajoguna samudbhava,
Yes.
and mahashana, and it's like it's a devouring, all devouring enemy, mahashano mahapapa, a sinful enemy. That's what.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. So Krishna, Arjuna's question is, why do we feel compelled to act in ways even when we don't want to act that way? I mean, we all have experience of that. Even when we are practicing Vaishnavas, yes, we try to control our senses. We don't necessarily perform the same kind of activities as people outside, or people who do not practice bhakti are performing. But at the same time, we find ourselves engaging in activities through speaking, through thinking, as if we are compelled. We can't just stop ourselves from saying something or doing something that that later on we regret, and then we justify, and then we go back and forth between regret and justification. And yeah, it's an experience. It's a common experience. Why does that happen? And Krishna's response to Arjuna's question is Krishna says, Kama esha krodha esha rajoguna samudbhava mahashano mahapapma vidyenam hiya vairinam. He says that it's lust only, O Arjuna. Right? That's born out of contact with material mode of passion. And these words are very important. He says, Rajo Guna Samudbhava. Now, what is the effect of Rajo Guna? How do we experience the mode of passion? What characterizes the mode of passion?
Desire, rajo ragatmakam vidhi.
Okay.
Trishna means a thirst for material
Yes.
enjoyment.
Very good. Excellent. Right. So what is the energy that's displayed when one experiences the mode of passion? Anxiety. That's right. Right. Even and that's true. It is anxiety, and it manifests in the form of restlessness. How many of us know what restlessness feels like? Right, just sit down to chant japa every day, and we know. We all have experience of restlessness. We find ourselves, our legs are sometimes shaking underneath the table. We are touching, like restlessness is just there in our bodies. Our bodies experience a lot of restlessness, especially when we live in the cities. We can experience it very readily. Right? We are restless. And we can also see, even as practicing Vaishnavas, we do experience these urges. Restlessness exists. Susan said, feeling out of control. Yes, exactly. And that's also why we experience anxiety. Jamuna Jaya, never enough. Again, directly applying to this verse, right? Contentment. So when there is contact with the mode of passion, even devotional service, right? The Srimad Bhagavatam explains devotional service in the 3 modes in Canto 4. And when devotional service comes in contact with the mode of passion, as we are conditioned, of course, devotional service, devotion, bhakti is not contaminated, but the performer of the bhakti is in contact with the material modes, especially as sadhakas, we can relate to this. Right? Then even in the performance of devotional service, we experience restlessness, we experience anxiety, and we experience dissatisfaction. And so when we ask ourselves, what are we dissatisfied with? We will find many times that our minds, even when we have left the material world behind, when we have made the decision to quit the material world and leave the material world, go back home, back to Godhead, our minds haven't. our minds are still conditioned. Our mind is still moving, and our mind, along with the false ego, is still being affected by the inertia of our previous lifetimes, several lifetimes, right? And our identification with the false ego and the mind is still very strong. Even as we, so one of the exercises my dear friend Hari Prasad has prescribed for me, which I'm trying to do every day, is to read the verse, Naham Vipro Nachanarapatir, Naham, the verse that Mahaprabhu talks about, where he says that I'm not a Brahmana, I'm not a Kshatriya, I'm not a Vaishya, I'm not a Shudra, not a Brahmachari, Grahastha, Vanaprastha, or Sannyasi. He says that I am simply the servant of the servant of the servant of the Lord of the Gopis. But even when we recite these verses, and for a moment we might actually intellectually experience who we are, our emotions are still very much rooted in our sense of identity in this material world. And so that the inertia, the winds in our subconscious are so strong that we just naturally experience agitation. Things are not enough. And that is the characteristic of the material body and the false ego. Right? The false ego is like a black hole. Do we know what the term in physics black hole means? Anyone?
We have Murli Gopal Prabhu on the
Yeah, I was actually excited for Murli Gopal to respond. Murli Gopal Prabhu, can you explain very quickly what the effect of a black hole is?
The black hole.
Yeah.
The black hole is the formation in space-time, wherein anything that goes in never comes out, especially when it crosses the event horizon. Once it goes through the event horizon, not even light can go. And it also creates ripples throughout space-time that travel all the way, up to us.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure Radha Muralidhar really enjoyed your definition of the black hole. Murli Gopal Prabhu is worshipping the deities right now. So the black hole is as they say, it's a black hole. It just sucks all energy that goes around it, right? And it can suck unlimited quantities of energy. Our false ego is like a black hole. And the reason why our false ego is like a black hole is because the desire of the soul can never be satisfied with anything material. The equation is set up to fail right from the start. So when the soul identifies itself with the material body and the mind and the ego, the result of that identification is dissatisfaction. It's impossible to escape that emotion. Right. So and this even as practicing Vaishnavas, this is very, very important for us to understand that the moment we invest in the false ego, the result of that investment is dissatisfaction. Which is why if you ask any process of yoga system, and this goes back to Athena's comment, any process, it begins with learning to detach ourselves from the false ego through the medium of our senses. That's why whether it's Ashtanga yoga, whether it's Bhakti yoga, whether it's Karma yoga, the practice to begin with is to start to detach from our senses, because the senses are the most gross expression of the false ego, right? And the mind is right behind, right? Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Manashyashtani indriyani prakrtirstani karshati. He calls that he names the mind as the sixth sense, right? And the mind is the mouthpiece for the false ego. If we can clearly listen to what our mind is saying, it is the expression of the desires of our false ego. So to begin with, Where if we have to cultivate satisfaction, Prabhupada writes in this purport, we have to learn how to control our senses and our mind. It's impossible to attain satisfaction without that, which is why Vamanadev, as the Supreme Lord, himself is demonstrating how to do this. Right? How much is enough? And in today's day and age, so this is where the trickiness of the situation arises for us devotees, right? Our story many times is, oh Krishna, if I have more, then I will be able to serve you more. How many of us have actually said this to ourselves? If I have a little more money, then I will be able to serve Krishna more. If I have a little more time, then I'll be able to serve Krishna more. In 10 years, once I get here, then I will be able to serve Krishna more. And many times that can be true. It can be true. But we have to be so careful to understand whether it is the voice of our false ego or whether it is the voice of our intelligence plugged into the soul. And it's tricky. Right? Somehow, Yukta Vairagya, as Saraswati Thakur so strongly emphasized it, Rupa Goswami talks about Yukta Vairagya. Yukta Vairagya means appropriate renunciation. Learning how to use our senses, our mind, all the resources that we have for Krishna's service, which is ultimately what a Bhakti yogi actually wants to do, because everything belongs to Krishna. Right? But Yukta Vairagya is tricky, because many times under the name of Yukta Vairagya, we are gratifying our senses. Prabhupada talks about how, the practice of Nirjal Ekadashi underwater. And this person is practicing Nirjal Ekadashi underwater, but like secretly drinking water, right? So the mind is very tricky, and it can pose itself as engaging everything in Krishna's service, and at the same time be secretly stashing away for sense gratification, which is why any form of yoga process begins with learning how to control our senses. And Krishna spends so much time in chapter 2 talking about sense control. Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehina asavarjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate. We'll come to that. The restraining of the senses, vacho vegam, manasa krodha vegam, jivha vegam, udarupastha vegam. It's so strongly emphasized. And it's important to actually practice that. Because unless we learn to practice sense control and self-control and mind, and learning how to say, this much is enough, we will never really be able to actually detach ourselves from the false ego. In fact, when we recite the prasadam prayers, and it's interesting how the prasadam prayers begin with, usually when we sing the prasadam prayers, it feels like a celebration and a relief, because the long class is over. We don't necessarily pay attention to the meaning of the prasadam prayers. Can anyone share the meaning of the prasadam prayers? How does it begin?
One who is Swalpa Punyavartam Vishwasanaiva Jayat, one who is like actually sinful cannot actually experience the glories of like Mahaprasad or the Supreme Lord Govinda, Mahaprasadi Govinde. Vishwasanaiva, faith will not come up in that person in these aspects.
So what's interesting, and I think that's a verse from the Padma Puran. What is interesting is that we start the prasadam prayers by saying that one will not be able to experience the effect of prasad. It says nama, holy name, brahmana, Vaishnava, and prasad. One will not be able to have faith if one's life is sinful. And then Bhaktivinoda Thakur's prayers, right? Sharira Ravidyacha. Usually we clap our hands, but it's pretty grave what he's saying. He starts with saying that the body is a lump of ignorance, right? And the senses are, he says, the senses are voracious, and amongst the senses, the tongue is the most voracious. the recognition that our senses cannot be taken for granted. And then he says, but Krishna is very kind, that he lets us satisfy our senses by Krishna's own prasad. So the importance here is the emphasis on sense control is very, very strong in our tradition. Right? So we can't just put that aside. So the first thing, even as practicing Vaishnavas, is we have to actively practice contentment and tolerance of the urges. Krishna says in the Gita, Matra Sparshasta Kunteya, Shita Ushna Sukha Dukkada Agama Apaino Anityas Tam Tatiksha Subharata. Recognizing that all of our material experiences are temporary, one must learn to practice tolerance. Right? And it's not an easy practice, but it's a necessary practice. Right? The second thing that is important for us, and this is where Prabhupada takes the purport to, the practice of varnashram. Because we have a nature, we have a false ego. It is important to engage it. There are necessities that come with our psychophysical being, that when we don't learn how to engage and satisfy properly, then our situation, even in terms of practice of bhakti, will become, we will not be able to do it with a peaceful mind. So the second thing is important, the recognition of the nature that we have been given. Prabhupada says, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur in Bhakti Aloka, which is the commentary to the Upadeshamrita, talks about how all the different principles that are applied look very different for the different varnas, look very different for the different ashramas. So this is again a very important principle. Understanding our varna is critical, especially for us embodied souls practicing or trying to practice sadhana bhakti. The understanding of our nature, our psychophysical nature, is important, because when we learn how to work with our psychophysical nature is the effect of all our previous karmas. Right? There are desires in it. There are needs in it. And then we have our physical bodies. There are desires and needs in it. And they're also very subconscious, meaning they have a very strong effect. When we talk about subconscious, we don't have control on it. It's pushing us in a certain direction. So when we don't have control on something, then we have to engage it. And through that engagement, we gradually learn how to control. So the practice of varnashram, again, is a way of learning how to engage our material body and minds based on their nature in Krishna's service. And that engagement will look different for different people. Right? And again, Vamanadev, as a brahmachari and as a Brahmin, is talking about contentment. So when we say, like so many times, even in our tradition, we talk about Brahmanas and we say, well, I love to study or I love to teach, that's why I'm a Brahmin. While that may be the real characteristics of a Brahmin, as Krishna says in the Gita, what are the qualities that he talks about for a Brahmin?
Shamo, Dama, Tapa, Shaucham.
Shama, Dama, Tapa, Shaucham. Right? Those are the characteristics, actual characteristics of a Brahmin. The intellect may be there, but you can also see that a Kshatriya has a strong intellect, a Vaishya has a strong intellect. But the characteristics of a Brahmin, the primary characteristic of a Brahmin is the ability to be Shama, Dama, Tapa, Shaucham. Right? Santushtam, satisfaction, contentment, peacefulness, self-control, austerity, purity, tolerance, honesty, knowledge, wisdom. Thank you, Milavana Prabhu. Religiousness, natural qualities through which a Brahmana works will look different for a Kshatriya, will look different for a Vaishya. The important thing here is to recognize and work with that. So if you apply the principles of a Brahmana to someone who has a Vaishya vritti, we will create restlessness. Right? And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, that's why he says it has to be applied. The principles of contentment and regulations have to be applied based on somebody's vritti, somebody's nature. That is the second principle. And the third principle, as practice. So once we do the first two well, the third principle, which is param drishtva nivartate, the engagement of the soul in Krishna's service. Right? Because the body impedes so much. The body makes everything so difficult that when we can learn how to keep the body and the mind and the ego peaceful by the practice of tolerance and by the engagement in through our varna and ashrama, then it's possible to then engage the soul in Krishna's service and experience the higher taste. Otherwise, there is just so much noise in the system, again, by the contact of the material mode of passion. It becomes very difficult to practice and experience Krishna. Right? So that is when we will truly experience satisfaction, is when the soul is satisfied in engaging in Krishna service. Then we can experience that very tangibly. And that takes time. Right? Until the anarthas are gone, nishtha, bhakti doesn't appear. It's only in the stage of nishtha does satisfaction in the performance of bhakti actually begin. Right, where the disturbances of, and that's tada rajastamo bhava kamalobhadayasche cheta etairanabidam sthitam satve prasidati. Right, the effects of the lower modes have gone. So, and then one can actually, the soul then begins to show up. We can get the glimpses of the soul's engagement in Krishna's service. So these three things, the practice of tolerance, especially around sense and mind control, meaning asking ourselves the question, how much do I want? How much do I need? And even if somebody has something more, or if the mind tells us, you know what, if you get a little more, then you can serve Krishna better. Let us be very, very watchful and cautious about those statements of the mind and learn how to be satisfied with whatever we need. We take whatever we need, but learn to be satisfied with it. That's one. Second is learning to engage our natures that we have been given, that are the product of our past desires in Krishna's service, which means we have to understand our nature and engage it accordingly. That's critical. And the third thing is then engaging directly in the activities of the soul in its relationship with Krishna, which is actually the performance of bhakti. And Prabhupada concludes so beautifully. He says that when we learn, so that when we engage our natures and we learn tolerance, then we can practice the chanting of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, peacefully. So those three steps, when we learn to do them systematically, steadily, every single day, we will see our bhakti is very consistent. And we will experience the soul in its relationship with Krishna. Thank you very much. I would like to stop here and open up for questions, comments, insights. Champaka, you had a question here. How can we determine when the mind is the voice of the false ego versus when it is the voice of the soul? And what to do when the mind is always changing / doubting? So Krishna says at the end of chapter 3, Evam buddhe param bhutva samstabhyam atmanatmanah jahi shatru mahabhaho kamarupam durasadam. So I love the words. Prabhupada translation is just so powerful. It says, controlling the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence. controlling the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence. It takes for us, and when deliberate spiritual intelligence looks like, it takes for us to parse what the mind is saying, parse out what the mind is saying. And for that, what we have to do is sit and have a dialogue with the mind. It's a conversation. Usually, when the mind is telling us a lot of these things, we are actually trying to act based on what it wants, or trying to disapprove or go against what it wants. And in both those situations, there is restlessness. But when we learn how to listen to what it's saying and parse out what is true from all the exaggerations, because there is a lot of exaggerations that happen, but there is a grain of truth. It's trying to point to something. And what's important for us is to parse out what that something is. When we get to the truth, then we will also learn how to satisfy that truth within the parameters of Krishna consciousness. And that takes some parsing, some patience, and it's hard work. It definitely is hard work. Writing helps a lot. Those are all activities in the mode of goodness. So deliberate spiritual intelligence means letting the mode of goodness come in. Seeking guidance, very critical. And many times seeking guidance also becomes interesting because we so much want assurance. We want more assurance than we want truth. So what becomes, we ask a lot of people, or sometimes we also, the truth is coming, but we're just not hearing. Right. So it's important to actually, when we ask for advice, important for us to know what we are asking for. Are we asking for truth, or are we asking for assurance? C.S. Lewis says something which I keep very closely. He says that if you're looking for comfort, you may never find the truth. But when you're looking for truth, you will eventually find comfort. So when we ask questions and seek guidance, we have to be looking for the truth. And that's what Vyasadev's example in the Srimad Bhagavatam is. When Narada Muni comes in front of him, he's not looking for, hey, assurance, oh, you've done good work. He's looking for, why am I feeling dissatisfied? Why am I feeling dissatisfied? And that gives the opening for Narada Muni to speak very directly. That is the Srimad Bhagavatam. The Srimad Bhagavatam is a product of sincerely seeking the truth. And when we don't do that, then we will continue to be trapped by our minds. Right? So that's how we can actually tap into the voice of the soul, is seek the truth, parse out what the truth is, and ask people who have done it well for advice. But when we are asking for advice, it has to be with the intention of seeking the truth, not assurance or comfort. Does that help? Okay. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Gail, is that you?
It's me.
Yes.
Yeah, I've never been quite able to understand this distinction between the performance of devotional service and devotional service itself. What I've understood is that devotional service, that's always pure, even though we may perform it with contaminated consciousness or with motives, selfish motives.
Right.
But if we're performing devotional service with motive, I know devotional service is supposed to be Krishna's energy and his internal energy, so therefore that can't be contaminated. But I just somehow or other I can't reconcile these two things, that we can perform devotional service with selfish motive, yet the devotional service itself remains pure. Can't put those two together somehow.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Devotional service is the natural relationship of the soul to Krishna. So in that sense of the term, the natural relationship, something that's natural, and this is so fundamental. I remember Govinda Prabhu, who has been such a big force in my own spiritual development. I was just expressing to him, this was back in 2011, Hari Prasad Prabhu and I were just talking to him about how conditioned we are, and I was just expressing my own conditioning. And he said, don't worry, the conditioning of the soul is much deeper. And I thought that was very profound and very assuring and very true, that the spirit soul's conditioning is much deeper than the material body's conditioning. And in that sense of the term, the soul is just eternally connected with Krishna. It can't be interrupted in any way. Whatever interruption we are experiencing is temporary. The soul's relationship with Krishna is untouched because matter can't touch spirit. But matter interrupts the experience of it. And that's the difference. Right? So, and the reason why matter interrupts the experience of it is because it's the desire of the soul to be separate from Krishna. So on one level, the eternal relationship of the soul with Krishna can't be touched because that's natural. That exists, and that relationship is completely spiritual, which can't be touched by anything material. But when we identify ourselves with the false ego, then the experience of that soul's relationship with Krishna is interrupted. And that's what.
Okay, I think that's helpful because it reminds me of the fact that the holy name is always potent, but we can shield ourselves from the potency by our consciousness, something like that. Like, the sun is always, bright and hot, but if you wear sunglasses, then
exactly
something like that.
Yeah, and Prabhupada also gives the example of water. He says that rainwater is pure, but when it falls on the ground, it gets contaminated. So there are many different examples that actually show how the pure consciousness of the living entity is colored temporarily because of its contact with the material world.
So the devotional service is always pure, but we are just not experiencing the purity of it due to our consciousness.
Yes, exactly. But when the consciousness gets cleared, purified over time, then that experience just naturally awakens.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. It's a lifelong question that you answered.
I hope you're contented, satisfied.
Working on it, Prabhu. Working on it.